I thought it would be useful to take the time to address a pretty big elephant in the room, and that is the negativity being spewed towards Bernie Sanders. And I'm not talking about, objective criticism of Bernie Sanders, because certainly I disagree with him on a number of issues. I don't agree with Bernie Sanders when it comes to a lot of foreign policy issues. I certainly disagree with him on Israel-Palestine. I think that he talks too much about Russia. So, really, there's a lot that I disagree with him about policy-wise and to some extent politically. But I've even seen progressives talk about Bernie Sanders in a really negative way, and this prompted me to kind of ask the question, do most progressives still support Bernie Sanders? Because, me personally, I do think we should support Bernie Sanders, because even if you might disagree with him strategically and think that he's coddling Democrats too much, which he is, I do still think that he's a huge ally to the progressive movement and a leader to the progressive movement, because he's pushing for the policies that I want him to push for, nonetheless, in spite of whatever criticisms you might have. So I asked my Patreon patrons if they approve or disapprove of Bernie Sanders, and the overwhelming majority, with 62 votes, are still feeling the burn in 2017 and approve of Bernie Sanders, whereas only 5 people disapprove and 3 people don't know. So I wanted to share their insight. So Luis Ventura states, "I've known Bernie for a long time. You can't get a more consistent politician who stands by what he says." David Bondi writes, "The only thing that would turn me away from Sanders is if he pulled a Howard Dean, something I highly doubt he would do, as Sanders has basically been on the same side of the same issues for practically 4 decades. I absolutely can trust Sanders." Jazz states, "I still support Bernie and believe he is doing what he believes is right for the people of our country. That said, I am very skeptical the Democratic Party can be reformed. The corporatist Dem elites refuse to let progressives lead, and I do not see that changing." Captain Jinglepants states, "He's still fighting for us, but he needs to be more vocal about the Democrats not fighting hard enough for us. I know he needs their support for 2020, but he's eventually going to have to realize they're not going to come to our side of the table." And finally, the OP Kingdom writes, "I loved Bernie in 2016, canvassed for him twice, donated multiple times, voted for him in the primary, but I'm starting to have my doubts. His foreign policy on Russia leaves a lot to be desired, and I wonder why he hasn't shown more strength against the DNC's un-American actions in the primary. If Bernie ran in 2020, I'd likely vote for him again, but it would be with less enthusiasm than last year." Yeah, so I think that this insight is really... it's important, because we need to know how progressives feel. And, I'm a little bit relieved to know that most progressives still support Bernie Sanders. But one thing that this poll shows, and of course this isn't a scientifically accurate poll, that goes without saying, but one thing that this shows me is that progressives, in spite of the fact that neoliberals like to say that Bernie Sanders has this cult of personality around him, that's not true, because we still can be objective and criticize Bernie Sanders. I've criticized Bernie Sanders. Many of us have criticized Bernie Sanders, and I think that that's important, because when you really put this candidate or any politician on a pedestal, you set yourself up for disappointment. But by acknowledging Bernie Sanders' flaws and saying he needs to improve on foreign policy and X, Y, and Z, I think that it shows that we are the more reasonable people, and we can acknowledge that even if we disagree with Bernie Sanders in some areas, he's still far and away the best ally progressives have in Congress. So this was a really great poll. Thank you so much to anyone that participated, and for those who shared your thoughts. I really find this very helpful, but I also want to know what people in the comment section think who didn't participate in this particular poll, because look, I've seen not too much, but certainly a significant number of people who claim to be progressive but no longer follow Bernie Sanders. And I really think that as progressives, we need to listen to one another and not shut down debate. So please tell me your thoughts down below. I'd love to hear from you.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.